Welcome to the International Express to Book Central, departing now. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. Hi there! Thank you for joining me today on the train to Book Central. I'm your host, Jules. Each week, while we travel along on this train, we will discuss a book or a short story or maybe a poem, and most definitely some medieval literature. I'll tell you something of the plot and then discuss some of my favorite aspects of whatever it is we just read. These episodes will of course contain heavy spoilers, as well as shock horror gasp, context and subtext, so be warned. Do you happen to be in the market for some hopeful fantasy? Was Game of Thrones a little too grim for you? Did its violence against women get to you too? Well, let me take you away from all of that. Welcome to the Discworld, created by the late genius Terry Pratchett. Today we're exploring Equal Rites, the first of his witches novels. I have to admit, I came to Terry Pratchett shamefully late, as in only this year. The world was getting a bit much, and I knew I needed to read something that was at once really funny and engaging, but also clever. I grabbed Equal Rites, and within minutes I felt a load lift off my shoulders. First published in 1987, Equal Rites is a riotous, fun, and imaginative fantasy book for readers of all ages. So I'm very happy to discuss the book with you today. I did also dive into Weird Sisters straight after, the second of his witches novels, so if y'all enjoy this episode, let me know, and I'll do one on that book as well. I'm going to quote the beginning of the novel at length because it's great. Here we go. This is a story about magic, and where it goes, and perhaps more importantly, where it comes from and why, although it doesn't pretend to answer all or any of these questions. It may, however, help to explain why Gandalf never got married and why Merlin was a man. Because this is also a story about sex, although probably not in the athletic, tumbling, count the legs and divide by two sense, unless the characters get totally beyond the author's control. They might. However, it is primarily a story about a world. Here it comes now. Watch closely. The special effects are quite expensive. A bass note sounds. It is a deep, vibrating chord that hints that the brass section may break in at any moment with a fanfare for the cosmos, because the scene is the blackness of deep space, with a few stars glittering like the dandruff on the shoulders of God. Then it comes into view overhead, bigger than the biggest, most unpleasantly armed star cruiser in the imagination of a three-ring filmmaker. A turtle, 10,000 miles long. It is Great Atuin, one of the rare astrocolonians from a universe where things are less as they are and more like people imagine them to be. And it carries on its meteor-pocked shell 4 giant elephants who bear on their enormous shoulders the great round wheel of the Discworld. On the Discworld, floating through space, we meet the wizard Drumbillet who, knowing his death is close, is following his wizardly instincts towards a village called Badass. There, the 8th son of an 8th son is being born. He passes on his staff and then passes away himself. Except that this son is a daughter. Meet Escarina Smith, or Esk for short. Granny Weatherwax, who helped during the birth, advises her father to destroy the staff. When that doesn't work, she says to hide the staff and never ever think about it again. Girls are witches, if they're lucky, but never wizards. Wizardry is men's business. And so the years pass, except that not everything is as it should be. Esk is a bit odd. She has a weird relationship with one of the trees in the backyard, who just so happens to hold the spirit of the deceased Drumbillet. One winter, she and 2 of her brothers are sent to check on Granny Weatherwax, and when they arrive, they find her cold and stiff. Terrified, the two brothers volunteer Esk for watch duty, while they run off to get help. Scared by a raven insistent on getting in, Esk runs into the woods. Unfortunately, the woods are also where the starving wolves roam, and she quickly finds herself cornered. As she prepares to go down kicking and screaming, the staff rushes across the woods from its hiding place in her father's forge and gives the wolves a piece of its magical mind. Back in Granny's hut, it turns out that Granny has only been borrowing the raven's mind. Waking up again, she witnesses the terrific magic coming from the woods and, with a heavy sigh, makes her way in to see what's going on. She brings an unconscious Esk back to her hut and tells the staff, rather stiffly, that it's out of line and should stay hidden. But it's clear something magical is afoot, and so the next day Granny Weatherwax speaks to Esk's father, Smith, and Esk's magical training to become a witch begins. Except that it's mostly doing chores, learning herbs and remedies, and perfecting an intimidating stare. It's not real magic, Esk thinks. One day, during a hike in the Weathertop Mountains, Granny gives in and teaches Esk something special, something only witches can do, borrowing. Together with Esk, she visits the mind of an eagle floating high above them. Borrowing is meant to be like a gentle visit, not a mental takeover. But Esk is brimming with energy and magic, so once Granny pulls back, Esk takes over the eagle's mind and soars away. Granny can do nothing but take Esk's body back home and wait for her to return. But when it's been days, she very much against her will takes the staff and flies out in search of Esk. When she finds the eagle, she can hardly feel Esk's mind within it. She has almost completely forgotten that she was once human. Using the staff's incredible power, Granny manages to bring Esk back to her body. Granny then tells Esk about Drumbillet and the happenings around her birth. When Esk, in response, creates an enormous fireball which sears through the layers of the earth, it becomes clear to Granny that Esk needs a different kind of teacher. She writes a letter to the unseen university and speaks to Esk's father once again. Esk, meanwhile, turns her brother into a pig. Girls still can't become wizards, but there is too much magic in Esk which she cannot control. So the two do eventually set off to find an entryway into the university, in the hope Esk might receive guidance there. Granny hates traveling and grumbles all the way, while Esk is filled with excitement and hope. Not even the fact that ever since the borrowing accidents she can see weird shadow things whenever major magic is afoot can dampen Esk's spirits. First stop on their journey is Ohulan Kutash, where Granny has an old friend, Hilta Goatfounder, who tells her she'll have to go to Ankh-Morpork to find an entryway to the university. Granny hates the idea, but Esk meanwhile is doing her very best to get lost in this grand town. She is successful and, brimming with magic, unleashes chaos wherever she goes, including in a pub where the proprietors try to steal her staff. Trying to get away from them, Esk hides on a boat in the middle of the night and falls asleep. Waking up, she finds herself miles down the river in the company of the Zuns, a traveling people who pride themselves on lying. Their leader, Amshat, accepts Esk on board, and so she travels on. When Granny tries to locate her through Hilta's crystal ball, she can see loads of shiny particles gathering around Esk as the staff seems to be pulling magic from the air, and this is giving Esk destructive capabilities. And so, Granny sets out on foot to follow Esk, grumbling all the way. Esk and the Zuns arrive in Zemphis. Amshat has come to appreciate her oddness, but Esk knows she has to make her own way. She charms her way, somehow, mostly by looking sad, onto a caravan en route to Ankh-Morpork. In this caravan she meets a wizard, Treatle, and his apprentice, Simon. Simon loves books and studying and magic, but he has a big stutter and his health isn't great. He hopes he'll still be let into the Unseen University, though, and in talking to him and the wizard, Esk is once again confronted with the fact that she will never be allowed to become a wizard. She runs off into the desert and falls asleep. In her dreams, she finds herself in the cold and grim dungeon dimensions, where the dark shadow things are whispering to her. There's also an enormous pair of doors which refuse to open to her. Thankfully, that's when Granny shows up, having followed Esk into the desert. She has borrowed Hilda's ramshackle broomstick, and while she still hates flying, at least it got her there in time, with some help from the dwarves. The two make their way to Ankh-Morpork, where Esk is summarily denied access to the Unseen University, especially once she is somehow incapable of performing magic on command for the Arch-Chancellor Qtangle. Granny is having a surprisingly good time, though, in Ankh-Morpork, where her witch capabilities are highly treasured. She even finds a way of sneaking Esk into the university, but as a maid. So Esk spends weeks cleaning, being bored, and getting more and more frustrated that she has no grip on her magic and that no one is teaching her. She runs into Simon again, though, who is flourishing at the university. They meet in the library, managed by the orangutan librarian Ook. She wants to learn how to read, which Simon agrees may not be a bad idea. But then the room begins to swirl, the shadowy things appear, and the books start flying. Suddenly, the staff whips out and hits Simon. Once he's unconscious, the things disappear. 3 days later, though, he is still in a coma, and Esk has thrown her staff into the river as punishment for hurting her only friend. Neither she nor Granny can find Simon's mind through their magic, as he seems locked away in the dungeon dimensions. Granny decides that now it is time for a confrontation, and so she goes to see Arch-Chancellor Qtangle. Furious that a woman has dared to enter the university, he engages her in a magical duel. Esk, meanwhile, sees that the things from the dungeon dimension have locked Simon's room, from which strange sounds and lights emerge. Carefully, she burrows into the living mind of the unseen university itself to break into the room. Once she's done that, all the lights and sounds stop, and now both Simon and Esk lie there unconscious. Esk's mind floats high above the world looking for Simon, until she too finds herself in the dungeon dimension. Simon seems to be playing with snow globes, surrounded by the shadowy things. One of the globes is a pyramid, containing within it the Discworld. As he plays with it, the pyramid is cracking, and Esk can feel it in her bones that it would be a very bad thing for it to break. She snatches it away and runs. The things try to force her to give it back by hurting Simon, but he tells her not to give in. He says the pyramid contains the idea of the world, and that here in the dungeon dimension, ideas are real. Meanwhile, the magical duel between Granny and Qtangle has ended in mutual respect. Finding the unconscious Esk and Simon, Granny knows that Esk will need the staff with her. So she and Qtangle head out onto the river in the pouring rain to bring it back. Once Granny places it into her hand, the staff also appears to Esk in the dungeon dimension, and the things begin to flee. Simon encourages her to use the staff to defeat them, but Esk has had a realization. The things have appeared whenever strong magic was afoot, because they feed on it. True strength and power lies not in using magic, but in knowing when not to use it. In the university, a large flash of light erupts, and the two children wake up. Esk is officially accepted into the university to work on this new magic of not using magic, while Granny gets to return to her cottage in the Weathertops. And that is the story of Equal Rites, except that, of course, there is so much more to it, all kinds of hilarious details and descriptions invented by Pratchett. I could not recommend a visit to Discworld more, so you can take in all those details for yourself. But before you do that, let's dive into some of the book's themes. I need to start this section with a confession. I was literally 2/3 through the book before it clicked for me that rights in the title also refers to rights, as in equal rights for women. Yeah, it took me longer than it should have. Sometimes being book smart still only gets you so far. But that confession is a great way to get into the main theme of the book, which is really that of gender equality. If you wanted to simplify it all the way down, you could say that Equal Rights sets out to show that women should not be limited to just one thing. that they should have access to both traditionally female and traditionally male occupations. But Pratchett actually goes quite a bit deeper. While the Unseen University, the Wizard Treacle, the Arch-Chancellor Q-Tangle, and even Simon are the strong male proponents of the belief that women cannot be wizards, a lot of the arguments against it initially also come, or especially come, from Granny Weatherwax. I found this a bit weird at the start, because she's such an independent and capable woman who will refuse to do something she doesn't want to till the bitter end. Granny is presented as a woman with a mind of her own, confident in her abilities and her worth, and proud of her trade. She puts a lot of stock in herself and in being a witch. One of my favorite Granny Weatherwax quotes is, "She was also, by the standards of other people, lost. She would not see it like that. She knew where she was. It was just that everywhere else didn't." So why is she seemingly holding Esk to such rigid standards? I've been pondering over this, and of course I'd love to know your thoughts if you've read the book, but here's the answer I eventually came up with for myself. Granny Weatherwax, despite all her independence and power, is also part of the generation who was raised with a strong division between the genders, with stronger categories. The idea that women are physically incapable of being wizards, too weak in body and mind, was drilled into her as well, and it's only through meeting Esk, getting to know her and discovering her own mental blocks, that she becomes aware that this division is a limitation. Even if her arguments had been based on wizardry is intellectual nonsense while witchcraft is real and natural and grounded, it nonetheless involved putting women down a little as being limited. Pratchett doesn't make this change of mind in Granny super obvious, as in he doesn't hit you over the head with it, but it was still obvious to me. It kind of reminded me of how I had, for a big part of my life, internalized some of the misogynist talking points I'd heard, and how I didn't become aware of those unconscious biases until I met new and different people who challenged my preconceptions. Upon being confronted with Esk and realizing that the world is more complex than the simply binary she had been taught, Granny throws her entire weight behind Esk's cause. That woman is willing to leave behind everything she knows, the woods she loves, and the people who are lovingly intimidated by her, and she heads out into the world that scares her in order to help Esk. And during that journey, she, and we as the reader, also find out that the skills of a witch are indeed very useful and practical. Granny's skills are greatly appreciated in Ankh-Morpork, more so than those of the wizards, who hold themselves a little more apart from the normal people. It gives Granny a boost, as well as Esk, to confront their world. And it is through Granny's witchcraft and her teachings that Esk realizes that real power lies in knowing when to use it and when to just do the work yourself. It is this realization which saves her and Simon, and it is something that she'd never have learned from the wizards at the university. Terry Pratchett's work is finally receiving more academic attention, after it was long put aside for being children's fiction or young adult fiction. In her master thesis titled "For Every Woman is at Heart a Witch, the New Iterations of the Literary Witch from Terry Pratchett to Sarah J. Maas," Kaylee Ann Keeton Sauveur analyzes the different literary iterations of the witch throughout history. The witch is a figure who changes with the times, as each time period and society adds on new characteristics and identifiers. While she started as a demonized scapegoat, the witch has evolved into a symbol for female power, starting in the Victorian age. Sauveur defines a witch as, quote, "a woman who uses power to effect change, or a woman who exists outside of the patriarchal structure as a figure of independent female autonomy," end quote. Her analysis mostly focuses on Pratchett's character Tiffany Aching, who experiences similar boundaries as Esk and is also encouraged by Granny Weatherwax. What Sauveur draws out of her analysis is that magical powers allow Tiffany to shape her own destiny, but also to change the traditional story of the helpless damsel in distress. There is also a validation within these stories, in which the young witch is welcomed and embraced by her community. What the recent academic interest in Pratchett's work, but also other modern witch narratives shows, is that the figure of the witch has been solidly reclaimed by readers and young women. Rather than a category to be dismissed, it now becomes a way to reclaim agency and a connection with the world. As I was a young girl desperate to be a witch, I can very much recognize myself in this, and am consistently grateful to authors like Pratchett for giving us not just spunky young heroines like Esk and Tiffany, but also older and capable female characters like Granny Weatherwax. It is the growth that both characters experience, the relationship between the two, and the way that they affect each other which really makes Equal Rites into a heartfelt and also feminist novel. I also find that it links very interestingly to the medieval text we spoke about last week, Rolf's Saga Gautrexona. There too we had the issue of a son not being born when he was needed, which led to all kinds of gender trouble, to borrow a phrase from Judith Butler. I'll say again what I said then. These thoughts about gender, its restrictions and its possibilities are nothing new. But each iteration of this conversation brings us a little closer to equality and a freedom to live as one pleases. Now, from the gender angle, let's dive into the writing itself. One thing probably everyone with a passing familiarity with Terry Pratchett knows is that his writing is very funny. I nonetheless wasn't prepared for just how funny it was. Well, it's become a bit cliché to say you laughed out loud, when we all know that the most you did was an audible snort or, ha. This book actually did make me have to suppress laughter in public. I mean, how could you not with some of the lines? Here's one of my favorites. The light was misty and actinic, the sort of light to make Steven Spielberg reach for his copyright lawyer. I mean, that's funny. Lines like that are just hilarious, but there is also real craft and skill behind them as well. In literary studies, we sometimes speak of intradiegetic or extradiegetic narrators. If they're intradiegetic, they are inside the narrative, meaning they are one of the characters in the story. Think, for example, of Nick in The Great Gatsby or Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye. An extradiegetic narrator is a narrator who stands outside of the narrative. They are often omniscient narrators, in the sense that they know exactly what each character is doing, thinking, and feeling at any given moment. In Equal Rites, we are dealing with an extradiegetic narrator, which is not unusual for fantasy novels. But what Pratchett does, through lines like the one I just quoted, is make it clear that this narrator is not part of the Discworld, but part of our world. How else would he know who Steven Spielberg is, or what copyright law is? Somehow, as the reader, you end up on the same team as the narrator. You're in on the joke, even if the characters aren't. It creates a lovely atmosphere, like being told a funny story by a friend or an uncle. It is not just funny though. There is also real ingenuity behind these little quips, which bring an incredible amount of life to the scenes. For example, when talking about a storm, Pratchett writes the following. The storm walked around the hills on legs of lightning, shouting and grumbling. I can picture a storm like this. We literally had one yesterday. Or describing a character as self-centered as a tornado, which feels odd until it feels completely and utterly correct. What I enjoyed immensely about the writing was that it felt like Pratchett had given himself the freedom to be both as precise and as loose as he'd like, as long as he got his point across. And this works immensely well. Pratchett also employs the fantasy tropes we are familiar with, but uses them in such a way that the reader is nonetheless surprised. From the beginning, Esk is the chosen one, for example, but she's also immediately the wrong chosen one. She has innate magical powers, but she actually needs guidance and teaching in order to learn how to control them. She is a girl alone in a dangerous world, but there are also kind and supportive people around her who help her get where she needs to go. This was my first time reading Pratchett, so while I was looking into the book, I did see quite some readers' comments that Pratchett was still clearly developing his style, as well as his characters. Having recently also read Weird Sisters, the second novel, I do kind of see what they mean. It was published only a year later, but it is clear that by that time Pratchett had found his groove with Granny Weatherwax especially. While in Equal Rites she is a little shy of the big world and a little more close-minded perhaps, she comes fully into her own as a confident, funny, and sometimes gently misguided woman in the other novels. There's also a smoothness in the world-building, especially in how expansive it becomes in the second Witches novels and later Discworld novels in general, while Equal Rites is still a little more limited in its view. I must also say that the ending felt very quick, although it tied up everything nicely. I did read somewhere that Pratchett apparently finished the last third of the book in one furious weekend of writing, which makes sense to me. The ending of the book is a good conclusion, in that it feels like a satisfying end to every storyline and to everything Esk has learned. But I also still wanted to know a little bit more about, for example, the things and the dungeon dimension. A final note on the novel's audience. Equal Rites' protagonist, Esk, is 9 years old, and this would technically place the novel in the children's literature section. It is definitely very readable for younger children. While Pratchett doesn't shy away from the mention of sex or romance, none of it is explicit, and these things will go over your kid's head just like they go over Esk's head. I'd read this to my nieces and nephews in a heartbeat, if I had nieces and nephews. But a part of me is also very glad that I read this book as an adult, because I would never have gotten all those little asides, the comments from the narrator, or even some of the underlying tension as a child. Although I guess that's the joy of rereading books. The best books are those who give you something new to appreciate each time you read them, and I think Terry Pratchett's books definitely qualify as some of the best. Also, and this is not an ad, the recent audiobook release is on Audible, in which the Witches series is narrated by Indira Varma, with Bill Nighy taking care of the footnotes and Peter Serafinowicz as Death, are excellent and a great way to get into these stories. If you've read Equal Rites or any of Pratchett's other books, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I'm working my way through the Witches series, but there are literally a dozen of other Discworld books, so I could always use some pointers on where to go next. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.